Wassily Vasilyevich Kandinsky, the son of a well-to-do tea merchant, was born on the 4th of December, 1866, in Moscow. His parents, father Wassily Silvestrovich and his mother, Lydia Kandinskaya, divorced in 1871, when Kandinsky was only 5 years old. He spent most of his childhood in Odessa, where, at an early age, Wassily showed an interest in art and an aptitude as a draftsman, and had led his family to arrange for drawing lessons. In his autobiographical essay called Reminiscences, Kandinsky remembered an unusual sensitivity to stimuli of color when, as a child in Odessa, paint boxes, watercolors, and brushes were provided by his aunt, Elizaveta Tikhiva, who was largely in charge of the boy's upbringing. After attending high school in Odessa, Kandinsky pursued his studies at the University of Moscow in law and economics. In 1892, following his studies, he was offered a university assistantship, got married to a distant cousin, Anya Shumikina, and everything seemed to point to a well-ordered bourgeois existence. Underneath this calm and conventional surface, a slow fire was burning, resulting in suddenly abandoning his home and profession and taking himself to Munich in 1896 to study art at a private art school. To develop his rather elementary level of artistry, he continued his studies with Franz Stuck, while at the same time he co-founded the Phalanx Artist Association in Munich. He began teaching at the Phalanx School, created in the winter of 1901-1902 as an adjunct to the Exhibition Society of the same name. Later that year, Kandinsky fell in love with one of his students, Gabriele Munter, who frequently accompanied him on many of his travels, and eventually committed herself to him in 1903. Kandinsky and his wife Anya, who continued to live in Munich, separated in 1904, and an amicable divorce was arranged in 1911. Munter remained Kandinsky's companion for a total of 13 years. The foreseen marriage never took place, and the two parted ways in 1916. Kandinsky co-founded two successive art associations devoted to raising the aesthetic consciousness of conservative Munich. First came the Munich New Artists Association, which preceded the publishing of an almanac and organization of exhibitions under the emblematic designation of the Blue Rider. Following the outbreak of World War I, now considered an enemy alien, Kandinsky was forced to leave Munich virtually overnight and return to Moscow for a 7-year interlude from Germany. In 1917, he married Nina Andreevkaya in Moscow and had a son, Vazlod, that died while only at the age of 3 in 1920. Upon his departure from Moscow in 1921, the artist again took up residence in Germany and settled a year later in Weimar, where he accepted a teaching position at the Bauhaus. After the Bauhaus closed for good in 1933, Kandinsky finally followed the general exodus to Paris, where in 1934 he relocated to the elegant suburb of Neuilly-sur-Seine, and where he spent the rest of his life until his death on September 13, 1944, at the age of 78. Kochel, Waterfall 1, 1900. The notion that a landscape betrays the state of the soul dates from Romanticism. Kandinsky may have been influenced by 19th century Russian painting or by the landscapists of the Barbizon school. But more than these, the immediacy of this canvas, with its generous brushstrokes, reveals the influence of the late Impressionist manner that had left its mark on the painter at a Moscow exhibition in 1895. Study for the Sluice, 1901. This small oil study, with its marked palette knife strokes and its clear structure, is among the artist's most accomplished early works. The subject for this study was a site on the estate of his cousin and sister-in-law, Menia Abrikosov, at Ikhtirkia, outside Moscow. The canvas includes a small figure whose bare, almost hidden outlines become visible against the dam's spillway structure. The dam extends through stagnant waters and reaches toward the fir trees on the other shore. A narrow color range describes an autumnal scene. The dark brown tonalities are heightened by rose hues moving across intermediary greens toward a strip of light blue sky. The artist at this stage is an acute observer of nature. The Old City, too, 1902. The mellow evening light gives a poetic aura to this view of Rothenburg, but the sharp, clear-cut volumes recall Paul Cézanne's paintings. Kandinsky's minute brushstrokes, heavy with pigment, make tiny tessera of color. They suggest the perfectionist precocity typical of many painters of that period, from Lovis Corinth to Gustav Klimt. The Blue Rider, 1903. Riding from right to left, the horseman is almost lost in the wide expanse of a rocky meadow, defined by the clear, curved line of a hill at its upper end. A row of birch trees, their white trunks enveloped by fall colors, partially bars the view toward the horizon at the right, while at the left, a light blue sky and white clouds are visible. The rider wears a blue cape and casts a prominent blue shadow. His white horse speeds along in the unrealistic posture of conventional racehorse depictions, front and hind legs stretched apart and tail pointing straight back. The title, referring to a solitary blue rider, was apparently added after the completion of the painting, but an indistinct, childlike outline in front of him might lead us to believe otherwise. The Farewell, 1903. During his first years in Munich, Kandinsky produced more woodcuts than oil paintings. This printmaking technique had been deeply rooted in German tradition since the late Middle Ages, and at the beginning of the 20th century, it was revived by artists of many different persuasions. Both the legendary subject of the work and Kandinsky's linear and decorative draftsmanship are clearly related to the woodcut tradition. Holland, Beach Chairs, 1904. This small painting is one of the most attractive from Kandinsky's early period. Lighter and more spacious than most others of the time, it recalls the divisionist works of the French neo-impressionist painters, whose theories interested Kandinsky. Blue, gray, and gray-green accents enliven a predominantly yellow tonality. Streaky in places and dotted in others, the free application of the paint allows the support to show through in the foreground, which, although devoid of objects, remains far from empty. Further back in the picture space, abandoned chairs stand around haphazardly, facing out to sea or toward the shore, as they form a serpentine along the receding beach. Houses are visible on a nearby, gently sloping hill. Beyond it, the sea and sky melt on the horizon. A calm, sunny mood pervades the painting. Portrait of Gabriele Munter, 1905. The Phalanx Group operated an art school where Kandinsky met Gabriele Munter, a young German painter who shared his life until 1914. During this period, Munter's sensitive, intelligent features appear in several portraits that Kandinsky painted. Riding Couple, 1907. Viewed across the river, the white, walled city with its golden and multicolored cupolas sparkles in the sunlight and is reflected in the stream below. Yet much of the rest of the painting is almost grisaille. Only a subdued light is allowed to penetrate the trees, leaving the riding couple in shadow. The dotted, mosaic-like technique serves Kandinsky well, as he seeks a narrative idiom comparable to that of old folk tales, with their universality of theme. The subject, lovers entwined in an embrace, riding in self-forgetful bliss through slender birch trees along a riverbank, is, of course, unabashedly sentimental. Trees in Bloom at Lana, 1, 1908. The intensity of the light green, made still brighter by the touches of yellow, is a celebration of springtime, exemplified by the blooming trees. The projection of the artist's feelings onto the painted motif, going beyond mere visual description, is one of the most conspicuous differences between French and Northern European painting at the beginning of the century. Rigsy, The Town Church, 1908. The arbitrariness of fauve color is one of the most important innovations that Kandinsky incorporated into his own painterly style upon his return to Germany from France in 1908. By emancipating color from the restraints of fidelity to nature, he took the first step toward pictorial autonomy, toward painting as a chromatic symphony. Munich, Schwabing with the Church of St. Ursula, 1908. Another striking example of the effect on Kandinsky of his encounter with Fauvism. Landscape with a Tower, 1908. In this mysterious nocturnal setting, the pervasive red-yellow color chord of the brick tower, the roofs, and the field in the lower left corner takes on a somewhat spectral character. The Blue Mountain, 1908-09. This work appears to reflect an awareness of Fauvism, a style that Kandinsky encountered during his trips to Paris. The effective integration of its tightly defined planes endows the Blue Mountain with an intriguing formal complexity. The three horsemen, juxtaposed against the mountain, are in front. Two outsized trees, placed in the middle ground and leaning toward each other, infringe on the shrinking patch of sky that constitutes the background of the painting. The color scheme relies on primaries, with green as an understated fourth hue. Crinolines, 1909. Ladies of high society, wearing wigs and holding fans and bouquets, are politely conversing in a small garden, where nature merely lurks in the background beyond the man-made structures. The world of society had always held some fascination for Kandinsky. Crinolines bespeaks a purely structural interest in the calculated interplay of coloristic effects, which the artist was formulating at the time for publication in his first theoretical treatise, On the Spiritual in Art. The firmly constructed crinolines builds on a suggestion of bands arranged as receding planes. Such deliberate, even pedantic structuring is eased by an engaging color scheme in which neutral greens dominate while yellow, red, pink, and orange hues combine to give the work its joyous mood. A vibrant, dotted surface further enlivens the scene. Picture with an Archer, 1909. Entering at top speed in the lower right of this large vertical oil painting, the mounted archer is turning backward in the saddle of his horse. We see him aiming his bow. Is the arrow pointed at a pursuing enemy? A parting shot, perhaps. Kandinsky doesn't tell us. Nor does he explain the writer's relationship to the quiet procession that appeared to be leaving the cloister in the background. The natural world seems to strive upward into a turbulent sky, defined by a dominant blue-green color chord with earth and rose as counterpoint. Yet, if there is symbolism in, for example, the juxtaposition of the huge trunk with its slender young tree that leans inward like a parenthesis, it is proposed so tentatively as to be there or not, at the viewer's discretion. Winter Landscape 1, 1909. The unexpected use of the color yellow in the sky and on the house at the center of the composition competes with the blue hues elsewhere in the landscape. This kind of opposition gives the painting an unsettling effect, reminiscent of certain pictures that the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch was painting at about the same time. Murnau, View with Railroad and Castle, 1909. The flattening of depicted objects, turning them into silhouettes, recalls the woodcuts that Kandinsky made during his first years in Munich. Improvisation 6, 1909. Improvisation 7, 1910. This is one of the earliest paintings in which Kandinsky discarded representation. The color arrangement, with barely any delimiting linear structure, transforms pictorial space into a zone of chromatic turbulence, a vortex that spirals into the upper right quadrant of the painting. Sketch for Composition 2, 1910. The thematic content of Sketch for Composition 2 is nothing less than baffling and has kept scholars guessing as to its precise meaning. Analysis has been further hampered by the artist's insistence that the painting simply had no theme, but merely reflected a feverish dream vision, carefully recomposed. Even so, the viewer cannot miss two centrally placed riders on white and blue horses, though it is unclear whether they are in combat or simply galloping headlong. Indistinct personages on land or in or near water stand, walk, run or lie, float or sink, all toward no visible purpose. All this commotion is set in a landscape in which waves, clouds, grass, trees, rocks, and mountain peaks envelop and partly merge with the human element. Boat Trip, 1910. This dark oil painting is striking in its tonal and coloristic contrasts, its clear, formal organization, and its mysterious action. Three boats, each manned by three blue oarsmen and one red pilot, move past an indeterminate structure toward a nearby ship. The strenuous undertaking takes place in dark waters under a partially obscured orb that shines through a mighty rainbow. There is no clue as to the significance of such vehement striving, which is rendered in emphatic brushstrokes that add further excitement to this scene charged with mystery. The Cow, 1910. The animal designated by the title is simultaneously idea, image, and plastic form. The title is important not only because it names the principal subject of the painting, but also because the image confers mood and meaning on the work as a whole. This holds true even though the white cow shape is painted so delicately as almost to escape notice, at least before the beholding eye adjusts to the overlapping images that constitute the composition and learns to distinguish between the individual objects, natural as well as man-made, in their close proximity to one another. Then the grazing animals to the right are reduced to small replicas of the great primal incarnation, which seems to lean into the mountain, while the mountain, in turn, presses into the more distant hills and sky. Murnau, The Garden 1, 1910. The ostensible subject is merely a pretext for the painter to weave a pattern of green, yellow, and red, augmenting that color chord with touches of blue and brown. Improvisation 11, 1910. Vestigally representational elements can barely be identified here, having become almost ghostly. A bright yellow triangle is once again the center of attention of an entire composition. Study for Winter 2, 1910-11. A complex area of yellows makes up the central triangle of pictorial space, and into it, red and blue objects seem to sink as if in a fluid. The other triangular areas, above and below, create a sense of recession. Romantic Landscape, 1911. Here are three horsemen again, as in The Blue Mountain, but this time they sweep down a white sunlit field. The work is constructed with nearly parallel linear accents, suggestive of roads, in a landscape punctuated by trees and rocks. The deep red sun over the hill adds a conspicuously romantic touch. Throughout the painting, multicolored brush dots indicate a spontaneous execution, reinforcing an underlying mood of breathless speed, consonant with the overt theme. Impression 3, 1911. According to the artist's hand list, Impression 3, Concert, was painted on January 3, 1911, 2 days after Kandinsky attended a New Year's concert in Munich. The largely abstract composition of the painting could be viewed as inspired by atonal music, but extant preparatory sketches reveal a much more direct relationship to the incident of the performance itself. The painting is divided into a densely populated left side and a relatively empty right. The composition is conceived diagonally, but the reliance on large, undivided color areas, as well as the presence of two nearly vertical pillars, bestow on the work a measure of stability. Although the large black area is identifiable throughout the sketches as the lid of a grand piano, at the same time, it also reminds us of the artist's identification of black with negative attributes. Lyrical, 1911. St. George II, 1911. This painting presents us with an intriguing game of elusive images. It would appear that the writer is thrusting the tip of his lance into the bleeding dragon while moving away from the defeated foe. The horse, whose red tongue echoes the visible bloodstains, turns his head around, as if to view the outcome of the battle. A mysterious figure precedes the saint, who rides through a hilly landscape. In this work, Kandinsky delimits the upper left corner and similarly defines the lower left, making use of a device here and in many other paintings that has as its apparent purpose the framing of the action, as if it were taking place on a stage. Composition 4, 1911. The painting opens up, fan-like, from a center defined by a pair of parallel vertical lines. It is notable for the way that arbitrary colors coexist with a firm linear structure. Vestiges of natural forms melt with pure painterly passages, as if to stress the separateness as well as the ultimate congruence of these two realms. The searching eye cannot miss certain natural forms familiar from earlier paintings. The central mountain, recalling among others the earlier Blue Mountain, reminiscences of Sketch for Composition 2, with its crisscross horse shapes, and at the lower right, its pair of recumbent figures, or echoes of the women in crinolines embedded in the mountain. Gigantic ascending figures, a rainbow, a celestial constellation, and an agitated sky are also rewarding finds for the beholder. Composition 5, 1911. Iconographically, this picture recalls various previously utilized motifs, but the principal sensation derived from this composition is of an abstracted eroticism, reflected in remote linear and planar approximations of the feminine anatomy, and in the pale skin color, emanating a tenderly rose and bluish aura. A contrapuntal movement of black lines interacts with these pastel hues. Notably, an aggressively prominent U-shape appears amid the insinuated nudity, issuing from hidden sources and widening like a moving river. Improvisation 18, with tombstones, 1911. The absence of hierarchical order in this painting is characteristic of the works of 1910 and 1911, as Kandinsky explored new territory. Improvisation 19, 1911. The discontinuity between the figures, who are rendered with rough black brushstrokes, and the background of the painting, a broad mottled area of variations on blue and a warm red border with touches of yellow and green, makes it impossible to speak of color and line as two independent, almost unrelated structures. The harmony of the colors would be just as intelligible without the representational sketch. The insubstantial figures are hardly more than a way to emphasize the tension at the edges of the painting. All Saints' Day 1, 1911. Impression 5, 1911. The black lines that constitute the figurative elements in this painting were developed from an observed motif, but they have little relation to the chord of primary colors that is the true essence of the work. Improvisation 26, Rowing, 1912. 3 pairs of nearly parallel black lines, suggesting oars, issue seemingly from nowhere at the very center of the composition. Only closer scrutiny reveals the outlines of boatmen familiar from Boat Trip, which, as is so often the case in Kandinsky's oeuvre, are identifiable beyond doubt from related works on paper, and, in this case, even a glass painting. Here, the pilot, situated at the rear of a barely identifiable vessel, is reduced to a color blotch that nonetheless manages to convey the appropriate posture. Improvisation 27. Though relatively undefined in figurative terms, nevertheless this presents us with rather overtly erotic elements. Embracing and reclining couples are rendered either in an emphatic color contrast, red and green, or even black and white, so as to stress the duality of the sexes, or, conversely, in an even tonality, perhaps to indicate the transcendence of that duality through the act of love. But even without Freudian interpretations, the suggestively voluptuous shapes, the snake-like black strokes, and the interplay of earthen, sweetish pink and bluish hues are wholly capable of conjuring the sensuality suggested by the subtitle of this improvisation. Painting with Black Arch, 1912. In this monumental, nearly square canvas, 3 commanding rock-like shapes floating in space appear to be on a collision course, suggesting some sort of cosmic calamity. Red and blue, often contrasted in Kandinsky's writings, heighten the dynamic tension of the principal shapes, which seem to be propelled with great force toward the center of the canvas. A second constellation of these shapes, held in more neutral hues, hovers above. The dominant color, at first concentrated in the clearly defined forms, is echoed in the painting's margins. The black whip-like arch, named in the artist's title, provides, together with a related linear pattern, a rhythmic counterpoint to the areas defined by color. Autumn 2, 1912. The tenuous diagonal across the lower portion of the painting gives rise to a spectacular image. A diaphanous landscape of soft autumn hues is reflected in the still waters of a lake. In this case, it is the title that provides the key to the painting's colors. As elsewhere, it is given by a reference to music. Deluge 1, 1912. Improvisation 28, second version, 1912. Composition 6, 1913. Painting with White Border, Moscow, 1913. Here, the artist provided his own analysis, emphasizing the graphic and coloristic features of the work rather than its figurative references. What interested Kandinsky were the carefully determined encounters between blue and red areas, the emergence of a center or of alternative centers, stark contrasts within tonalities, tensions between clear and smudged passages, and lastly, the revelation of the border as a formal device that would give the composition its ultimate meaning. A conspicuous, gleaming lance form which, extending from the composition's center, aims at the fang-like shapes at the lower left. This white streak, pointed at a grasping form, recalls St. George in the act of killing the serpent. Improvisation 34, Orient 2, 1913. Improvisation 34 appears wholly non-objective at first glance, exceeding the degree of abstraction generally seen earlier. Disembodied, though hardly de-eroticized, the motif of a reclining figure, positioned parallel to the picture's lower edge, becomes recognizable in the composition. Kandinsky characteristically sets the stage by introducing emphatic diagonal accents in the upper left corner of the canvas. Oval shapes, as well as sweetly colored dabs, alternate with calligraphic superimpositions to intimate an oriental flavor. Paint is applied loosely, and the deep colors are so balanced as to prevent the domination of any one hue. The tonal disposition corresponds to the painting's structure, receding from the fullness of the upper left to the virtual vacuum of the lower right. Composition 7, 1913. This composition stands out as a work of extraordinary intensity and power, and is overpowering the viewer with the sheer force of its energetic shapes and radiant colors. Dominating the work and imposing itself on the viewer is the composition's central eye shape. It functions as an ordering element, an emblem of human intelligence, piercing the surrounding chaos to establish contact with the viewer. Although the painting is seemingly unstructured, a sense of direction nevertheless emerges through force lines moving in a dynamic crescendo from the upper left toward the center. In the process, echoes are evoked along the right margin and eventually exhausted at the lower left, where dominant primaries and their superimposed linear accents yield to an amorphous monochromatic area. Black Lines 1, 1913. Shapes in complementary colors, with the primaries plus green dominant, float weightlessly in a palpitating gray-yellow space, adjoining and overlapping over a flat surface. A spidery linear web follows its own rhythms while lending structure to the composition as a whole. The painted black lines are energy carriers and directional signs. At times, they are the agents of an explosive action that contrasts with the slow pulsation of the colored shapes. A stage for these complex dynamics is provided by the recurring device of heavy parallel diagonals in the upper left corner. In this instance, a green triangle supported by an attenuated orange arc, and further provided by a deep red curtain form that acts as a stabilizing border running the full length of the painting's right edge. Improvisation, Deluge, 1913. Once again, Kandinsky alludes to the biblical deluge and to the idea of chaos. Here, however, the relatively cool colors and the black background dampen the explosive energy of the scene, and Kandinsky lowers the temperature of the large red shapes by putting layers of calmer colors on top of them. Painting with White Form, 1913. The idea of pictorial core, a vortex upon which all energies of the painting converge, was one of the earliest organizing principles to appear in Kandinsky's work. Here, The core is the white blot to the left of the center. Fantastic Improvisation, 1913. The dark blot at the center of the painting draws the swirling strokes of color into one central vortex of movement. The more isolated areas in the corners act as a frame for this dominant motion. Painting on Light Ground, 1916. This is among the first of Kandinsky's works to begin making the transition from his expressionist style to what eventually became his geometric constructions years later at the Bauhaus. The heavy black outline of the central image strongly contrasts with the pink and bluish pastels of the margins. The work as a whole is structured in 3 tiers: background, stage, and action, although the last 2 remain ambiguously interwoven. A dynamic sense of depth, almost of a vortex, is created as the eye is drawn inward from the painting's margins to its center. Concentric circles, spheres and tooth-edged ovids, boat and moon shapes, plant-like growths, and agitated flames all gravitate toward something like an enchanted lake. Moscow II, 1916. Twilight, 1917. Twilight is somber in color and mood. The composition appears to be painted from the top down, with 2 distinct constellations tenuously linked to each other. The background suggests a turbulent sky with a mighty rainbow spanning mountaintops. Women in Crinoline, 1918. Painted during his Russian sojourn, this small work on glass is so exceptional as to be accountable only as a form of private diversion. Both the theme and the technique are quite remote from the artist's central preoccupations at the time. In the Gray, 1919. In works like this, previously chaotic compositions begin to become organized. The placement of the 2 red areas and the central black one announces the artist's preference for arranging forms along a diagonal. Yet the black strokes and thread-like lines are still reminiscent of Kandinsky's artistic idiom from the Munich period. Red Oval, 1920. This small, square canvas presents a tripartite division between, first of all, the many shapes and colors lying on the surface, then the intermediate, bright yellow rectangular plane against which this imagery is projected, and finally, a stained green square that functions as background. But as if to stress the ultimate unity of these 3 levels, the fore and middle ground spill into the background, thereby softening somewhat an otherwise distinct separation. A deep red oval sun off the canvas's center preempts the viewer's attention, and only gradually are other elements admitted: pale moons, reminiscences of boats, oars, and rowers, as well as color intimations of green growth and blue mountain ranges. The extension of such images from the surface and unidentified beyond suggests a dialogue between here and there, between measurable spaces and a surrounding infinity, a dynamic that becomes the implicit theme of this prescient work. White Line, 1920. There is a dynamic tension between the rectangular shape of the canvas itself and the large trapezoid shape that seems to be in front of it, and whose corners extend beyond the edges of the painting. This 2-layer effect, together with the projecting white arc in the middle, makes the pictorial space seem to bulge outward at the center, as in a relief, a sharp difference from the works of 1910 to 1914. Red Spot 2, 1921. Red Spot 2 markedly advanced Kandinsky's progress toward a new idiom. Among its attributes are a firmer structure, a livelier sense of implied movement, and a greater compositional clarity, as well as an increased schematization of abstract images and reminiscences. Furthermore, the interaction between planes is rendered more readable, as the images surrounding the red spot of the title have gained in size and clarity. The white intermediary platform now remains separate from the dark background areas, contrasting sharply with them through hard edges whose corners have been blunted. The colorless background itself is suggestive of infinite spaces surrounding a finite world. Black pattern, 1922. A trapezium divided into tiny cells to be filled in with colors in later paintings here becomes the center toward which the other shapes gravitate. The geometrically conceived forms are arranged on overlapping planes. The seeming evocation of ships and fish in the lower left corner is a touch of capricious irony rather than a genuine figurative reference. Composition 8, 1923. Because of its size and commanding presence, but even more because of its serene formal disposition, Composition 8 may be considered the masterpiece of the Bauhaus years. The lingering painterly forms and textural effects of the transition period are gone. Instead, geometric elements, triangles, circles, and semicircles, regular and irregular squares, half crescents, and single, parallel, and crossing lines and bars float free, but in measured interplay, in and on an animated space. What in some earlier compositions appeared as multi-level interaction has now given way to an aesthetic of well-tempered placement, as elements are situated in a light-filled space of subtly modulated colors. Two heavy black lines convey the twisting effect created by the brown trapezoid as it tilts away from the picture plane. The turning of the triangles and quadrilaterals in space reflects this tension, and where they overlap, there is a complex mingling of their colors. For Kandinsky, the expressive character of this art, its drama, arose from these dynamic interactions between shapes and colors. As the title of this painting suggests, its pictorial structure demonstrates the balance between opposing forces. The complex interplay in the picture between superimposed forms, a welter of straight lines set against curves and circles against rectangles, is resolved by the equilibrium between the two principal circles set in opposite corners. The strong diagonal axis that connects the two is emphasized by an arrow. The colors, too, are arranged in accordance with this opposition, so that the warmer reds and yellows predominate in the upper left and the cooler blues in the lower right. Within this color scheme, the two circles serve as alternatives, a cold vortex and a hot one. The compositional clarity sought in this type of painting is a result both of Kandinsky's evolution as an artist and his concurrent experience as a teacher. Yellow, Red, Blue, 1925. This sizable, emphatically horizontal canvas invites a reading from left to right, following the sequence of its title. It is constructed around two compositional centers, and within that framework, it deals explicitly with the sequence of the three primary colors. Combining two contrasting shapes with three different hues, it generates an intriguing 2 versus 3 complexity well known to musicians. The aggressively yellow area on the left, constrained by an open-ended rectangle, opposes the large blue circle on the right. Between these two poles lie churning reds in geometric and biomorphic shapes. There is nothing schematic about this catalog of primaries or about its juxtapositions of shapes, for each element is muted almost as fast as it makes its discrete appearance. Thus, the active yellow plane is surrounded by a calming light brown aura, The central reds are dampened by darker tones, ending in black, and the blue circle is partly covered and decidedly reduced in its radiating potential by multicolored forms. Several circles, 1926. Scores of small round shapes, some overlapping, orbit about or sometimes within a dominant blue circle surrounded by a shining aura. These multicolored constellations float on a modulated black surface, which, through the nuances of its texture, suggests greater or lesser depth, as in water seen from a height. The painting is in part pure magic, possessed of mysterious revelatory powers. For circles, and by extension celestial bodies orbiting through the universe, speak to our emotions, reminding us that insignificant humanity participates in a cosmic order. Hard but Soft, 1927. On Points, 1928. 5 large triangular structures rest their acute angles on the top bar of a 3-tiered base. Their upper components are reinforced by smaller triangles, some inverted, others functioning as arrows. The objects of their aggression are several circles, 7 to be exact, with one dominating at the upper left. A solitary pinkish-red square resting on the base completes the catalog of primary shapes. The work is agitated, as its main forms perch precariously and in defiance of the laws of gravity on an unsupported, floating base. 13 Rectangles, 1930. The circle, the triangle, and the rectangle are the main vehicles of Kandinsky's geometric theories. Only in exceptional cases are these 3 component parts of the geometric edifice found in total isolation from one another. 13 Rectangles, an oil on cardboard completed in June 1930, constitutes such an exception, and is to the quadrangular mode what Several Circles is to the circular. Largely interlocking, at times marginally overlapping, and in a few instances unattached, the rectangles and squares are cast in primary colors and float restrained elegance on a neutral light green background. Development in Brown, 1933. Overlapping hard-edged planes, orthogonal or circular, close in from both sides on fragile crescents and triangles, which maintain themselves against the deep brown tonality in a light central area from which all escape routes are barred. The somber mood of the work is hard to disassociate from the ominous world events of the time or from the artist's own darkening outlook, but it would nonetheless be misleading to suggest a direct relationship between them. Composition 9, 1936. A firm architecture underlies the playful surface treatment of this work, thus perpetuating a kind of contrast or tension that the artist had deployed in earlier stages of his development. 2 corner areas, the yellow upper left and the greenish lower right, may be read as background, against which 4 hard-edged diagonal stripes are projected. On both these planes, free and geometric forms dance lustily around an emphatic heart shape, defined by a heavy black outline. Kandinsky's color in Composition 9 is carefully adjusted to lend the middle plane an optically convex character, with the central red stripe pressing forward as paler hues gradually recede toward both margins. Dominant Curve, 1936. Tensions are felt in part on the surface, where an ultimately dominating question mark-shaped curve resists an onslaught of black lines emanating from a large yellow circle at the upper left. We are aware of a sculptural third dimension evoked by the powerful vertical shape near the center, and even more so by a staircase image in the right half that atypically pierces the flatness of the surface. The staircase not only leads into the depth, but supports the vertical shape in its pointed dynamic. These hectoring shapes stand somewhat in contrast to the pastel colors of floating circles and freeform elements. A separate emblematic form within a vertical rectangle at the upper left, as well as 3 black-rimmed pulsating circles placed in a row at the opposing right margin, give additional iconographic impetus to one of Kandinsky's most powerful canvases. Composition 10, 1939. Although the painting is meticulously structured, we seem to be viewing a nocturnal bacchanalian dance of abstract forms, a pas de deux of loose shapes and somber colors, set on an entirely black background. Reminiscences of the objective world are paired with organic and geometric signs, suggestive at times of universal or cosmic meaning. In the prominent, coloristically subdivided circle at the upper margin of the canvas, such sources tend to merge, while open book forms, chessboards, and flame-like fangs carry more specific, earthy connotations. The prime tension here, however, arises between 2 large anthropomorphic forms, one loosely held together, the other more compact, whose bases touch, their upper parts remaining in rhythmic imbalance as they incline away from each other. Reciprocal Accord, 1942. 2 wedge shapes incline toward each other as their respective sharp lower points touch the bottom edge of the canvas. The prominent wedge forms in both instances are reinforced, or perhaps burdened, by a collection of quasi-geometric and biomorphic planes that appear to participate in the action. Circular, rectangular, and organic shapes float between the 2 protagonists, as well as behind them, as if they were the object of negotiations. A grave, ceremonious ritual is suggested by the nearly symmetrical form personages as they leave their respective pastel backgrounds to enter a shared, off-white central environment. Tempered Élan, 1944. In purely formal terms, a duality is reflected in the marked division of the surface by a heavy, not to say aggressive, diagonal waveform, which effectively separates the 2 emblematic images from each other. Furthermore, there are unmistakable references to an angelic form on one side and the familiar mounted rider on the other.